Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The barber paradox. In a small village, there lives a barber who follows a single rule. He shaves all and only those men in the village who do not shave themselves. And this rule seems simple enough until the question emerges: does the barber shave himself? And suddenly the logic collapses into contradiction. If the barber shaves himself, then he belongs to the group of men who shave themselves, which means according to the rule, he should not shave himself, because he only shaves men who do not shave themselves. But if he does not shave himself, then he belongs to the group of men who do not shave themselves, which means, according to the rule, he must shave himself because he shaves all men who do not shave themselves, and the loop tightens without escape, spinning endlessly between two impossible options. Bertrand Russell popularized this version of his own paradox as a way to make the abstract problem of self-referential sets more accessible, more human, more vivid, because a barber is easier to imagine than a set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Yet the logical structure remains identical, a rule that turns inward and devours its own coherence. The paradox reveals something unsettling about definitions and categories, that not all rules can be consistently applied, that language and logic can conspire to create situations that seem perfectly reasonable until examined closely, and then they shatter. Some philosophers argue that the barber simply cannot exist, that the rule itself is contradictory, and therefore no such barber could ever follow it in reality, while others suggest that the problem lies in assuming the rule must apply universally, that perhaps the barber is exempt from his own rule, or that the village contains no barber at all. The paradox also exposes the danger of self-reference, the way that statements or rules that loop back on themselves can generate infinite regress or outright contradiction. And this has implications far beyond barbershops, touching mathematics, computer science, law, and any system that attempts to regulate itself from within. In set theory, the barber paradox mirrors Russell's discovery that naive set theory permits the construction of sets that cannot exist without contradiction, forcing mathematicians to impose restrictions on which sets are allowed to form, creating hierarchies and boundaries to prevent self-reference from poisoning the system. The barber stands at the edge of reason, a figure trapped in a loop of his own making, unable to shave or not shave without violating the very rule that defines his existence, and in this way, he becomes a symbol of the limits of logic, a reminder that not every question has an answer, that some problems resist resolution no matter how carefully they are examined. The paradox lingers in the mind, a simple story about a man and a razor that somehow reveals a crack in the foundation of thought itself, and once noticed, it cannot be ignored, appearing again and again wherever rules turn inward, wherever systems attempt to contain themselves, wherever language reaches the boundary of what it can coherently express. The card paradox. Imagine a card, simple and rectangular, lying flat on a table, and on one side is written a single sentence. The statement on the other side of this card is true, and already the mind begins to sense danger, a trap being set. The card is flipped over, and on the reverse side another sentence appears. The statement on the other side of this card is false. And now the contradiction is complete. A perfect loop of mutual negation that cannot be resolved no matter how many times the card is turned. If the first side is true, then the second side must be true, as the first side claims. But if the second side is true, then the first side must be false, as the second side claims, which contradicts the assumption that the first side is true. And if the first side is false, then the second side must be false, as the first side incorrectly claims it is true. But if the second side is false, then the first side must be true, as the second side incorrectly claims it is false, and the cycle spirals endlessly without rest. The card paradox is a variation of the liar paradox, but its physical form makes the contradiction feel more tangible, more concrete, a paradox that can be held in the hand and turned over and over as if repetition might somehow reveal a hidden answer that logic cannot provide. The paradox demonstrates how self-reference can be distributed across multiple statements rather than contained in a single sentence, showing that contradictions do not need to be immediate or obvious to be genuine, that they can emerge from relationships between statements rather than from the statements themselves. Philip Jourdan, a mathematician and logician, is often credited with popularizing this version of the paradox in the early 20th century, using it to explore the limits of truth and reference, and to illustrate the kinds of problems that plagued attempts to formalize logic and mathematics during that era. The card paradox also reveals something about the nature of truth itself, the way that truth is not a property that statements possess in isolation, but a relationship between statements and the world, or between statements and other statements. And when those relationships form closed loops, the concept of truth begins to break down. Some philosophers argue that the statements on the card are neither true nor false, but meaningless, that they fail to refer to anything outside themselves and therefore do not qualify as genuine propositions, while others suggest that the paradox exposes a flaw in the classical assumption that every statement must be either true or false, that perhaps some statements occupy a third category, undefined or indeterminate. The card sits on the table, innocent and menacing, a small object that contains an infinite problem, and no amount of flipping will resolve what is written on its surfaces. No clever interpretation will untangle the knot, and so it remains, a monument to the limits of language and logic, a reminder that not all questions have answers, that some truths are forever out of reach, caught in loops that reason cannot break. The binding problem: how your brain unites what it processes separately. A neuroscientist examines how the brain processes visual information, discovers that different features of objects are processed in different brain regions. Color is processed in one area, motion in another, shape in a third, orientation in a fourth, and all these features are analyzed separately, by specialized modules, by distinct populations of neurons. And yet when you look at a red ball moving to the right, you do not experience color, motion, and shape as separate. Do not see redness here and roundness there and rightward motion elsewhere, but see a unified object, a red round ball moving right, and all the features are bound together, are experienced as properties of a single thing. And this creates the binding problem, the puzzle of how the brain, which processes features separately, creates unified conscious experiences, how separate neural processes give rise to integrated perception, how the many become one. And this problem is fundamental, touches on the nature of consciousness, on how neural activity becomes experience, on what unifies experience into coherent wholes, and no complete solution exists. Various theories have been proposed, but the binding problem remains one of the deep mysteries of neuroscience, a gap between our understanding of neural processing and our understanding of consciousness. Imagine the visual system as a factory, with different departments processing different aspects of the product. One department handles color, another handles shape, another handles location, and all work in parallel, all process simultaneously, and each department produces its output color information, shape information, location information, and somehow these separate outputs must be combined, must be integrated into a unified representation, must be bound together so that you experience a red ball rather than redness and roundness as separate unlocalized features. And the binding problem asks how this combination occurs, what mechanism ensures that the right features are bound together, that the redness is attributed to the round object and not to the square object that happens to be present in the scene. And this correct attribution, this accurate binding, is critical for coherent perception, for navigating the world successfully, and yet how the brain achieves it remains unclear. The binding problem has two aspects: the feature binding problem, which asks how different features of the same object are bound together, and the object binding problem, which asks how different objects are kept separate, are not confused with each other, and both aspects are challenging. Both reveal that perceptual unity is not given automatically by neural processing, but requires some mechanism, some process that groups features appropriately, and various mechanisms have been proposed. Attention has been suggested as a solution. The idea that attention binds features, that attended objects have their features integrated, while unattended objects do not. And this explains why feature binding errors occur when attention is diverted, why illusory conjunctions occur where features from different objects are misbound, are attributed incorrectly. Visualize attention as a spotlight that illuminates objects one at a time, and within the spotlight features are bound, are integrated, and outside the spotlight features remain separate, are not integrated, and this attentional binding theory has some support, has experimental evidence showing that feature binding requires attention, that without attention, features can be perceived separately without being bound correctly, and illusory conjunctions are more common under conditions of inattention, supporting the idea that attention is necessary for binding. But attention cannot be the complete solution, because some binding occurs pre-attentively. Some feature integration happens automatically before attention is applied, and so attention is part of the story, but not the whole story. Another proposed mechanism is temporal synchrony, the idea that neurons representing features of the same object fire in synchrony, fire together, and this synchrony is the binding code, is what marks features as belonging together and neurons representing different objects, fire at different times or with different phases, and this temporal separation keeps objects distinct, prevents their features from being bound together. And this synchrony theory has been influential, has generated extensive research, has led to discovery of synchronized neural oscillations in visual cortex, but the theory faces challenges. It is not clear that synchrony is sufficient for binding, it is not clear that consciousness depends on synchrony, and some experiments have failed to find the predicted correlations between synchrony and perceptual binding, and the theory remains controversial. A third approach argues that binding occurs through convergence, through hierarchical processing, where features are combined in higher-level areas, and early visual areas process features separately, but project to higher areas that represent combinations, that have neurons responding to specific conjunctions of features. And these conjunction neurons represent bound objects, represent integrated wholes, and binding is achieved through this hierarchical architecture, through neurons that explicitly encode feature combinations. And this approach has support from single neuron recordings showing that higher visual areas have neurons with complex selectivity, neurons that respond to specific combinations of shape and color and motion, and these neurons could be the neural basis of bound object representations. The binding problem also connects to consciousness, because unified conscious experience seems to require binding, seems to require that separate neural processes be integrated into coherent wholes, and some theories of consciousness, like integrated information theory, make integration central, argue that consciousness arises from integrated information, from systems where different parts interact and constrain each other, and binding as a form of integration is the combination of separately processed features into unified representations. And understanding binding may be crucial for understanding consciousness, may reveal how neural processes give rise to unified experience. The problem also has practical implications. For understanding neurological conditions, where binding fails, where patients see features but cannot bind them correctly, and such conditions exist. Barlint's syndrome is one example, where patients can see individual features but cannot perceive objects, cannot integrate features into wholes. And these patients provide evidence that binding is a genuine process, is not automatic, can be disrupted by brain damage. And studying these patients helps understand normal binding, helps identify the brain regions and processes necessary for feature integration. Some philosophers argue that the binding problem is really a problem about consciousness, about how physical processes give rise to subjective experience, about the hard problem. And binding is one aspect of this, is the problem of how separate neural processes give rise to unified conscious experiences. And solving the binding problem may require solving the hard problem, may require understanding how neural activity becomes experience. And this makes binding one of the deepest problems in neuroscience, a problem at the interface between neuroscience and philosophy of mind. The brain processes features separately, color here, motion there, shape elsewhere, and yet you see unified objects, see red round balls moving, see integrated wholes, and how this integration occurs, how the separate processes give rise to unified experiences, remains one of the great unsolved problems. The binding problem stands, challenging, fundamental, revealing a gap between our understanding of neural processing and our understanding of perception. And various theories exist, various mechanisms have been proposed. Attention, synchrony, convergence, but no theory is complete. No theory explains all aspects of binding, and the problem persists as one of neuroscience's deepest mysteries. A puzzle about how unity emerges from multiplicity, how the brain binds what it processes separately, and the question remains open. The mechanism remains elusive, and the binding problem endures. The blind sight paradox. Why some blind people can see without seeing. A patient suffers damage to the primary visual cortex, the region of the brain that processes visual information and produces conscious visual experience. And the damage is severe, destroys the tissue completely, and the patient reports being blind, reports seeing nothing, experiencing only darkness in the affected visual field, and vision tests confirm the blindness. The patient cannot identify objects placed in the blind region, cannot read letters, cannot describe colours or shapes, and by every standard clinical measure, the patient has lost vision in that part of their visual field. And yet something strange occurs. Experimenters place objects in the blind field and ask the patient to guess where they are, to point at them even though the patient cannot see them. And the patient protests, says this is pointless, says there is nothing to see, but when forced to guess, the patient points accurately, reaches correctly, identifies the location, and sometimes even the nature of objects at levels far above chance. And this ability, this capacity to respond to visual information without conscious visual experience is called blind sight, and it creates a paradox. The patient is both blind and not blind, both lacks vision and has vision, lacks conscious sight but retains unconscious visual processing. And this dissociation between conscious experience and information processing challenges our understanding of perception, challenges the relationship between consciousness and function, and raises questions about what vision is, whether seeing requires awareness, whether perception requires experience. And this is the blind sight paradox, a phenomenon that reveals that consciousness can be separated from processing, that the brain can use information without the person experiencing it. Imagine the blind sight patient's perspective, looking straight ahead, and part of the visual field is normal, contains conscious visual experience, objects and colours and shapes, and another part is blank, is darkness, is absence of experience, and experimenters place an object in the blind region, a ball perhaps, and ask where it is, and the patient says, I don't know, I can't see anything there. And the experimenter says, just guess, point to where you think it is, and the patient reluctantly points, randomly it seems. And yet the pointing is accurate, is directed toward the ball, and the patient is surprised. Says it was just a lucky guess, has no feeling of seeing, no visual experience that guided the response, and yet the accuracy persists, trial after trial. And the paradox is that the patient is using visual information, is processing it, is responding to it, but is not conscious of it, is not experiencing it. And vision has split into two components: conscious experience and information processing. And these normally go together, but in blind sight they come apart. The blind sight phenomenon has been documented in multiple patients, studied extensively, and the mechanism involves intact pathways from the eye to brain regions outside the primary visual cortex. Pathways that process visual information for action and navigation without producing conscious experience. And these pathways allow blind sight patients to respond to visual stimuli without seeing them. And the existence of these pathways shows that vision is not a single unified process, but involves multiple systems, some conscious and some unconscious. And damage to visual cortex eliminates conscious vision, but leaves unconscious visual processing intact. And this dissociation reveals something fundamental about consciousness, shows that information processing is not sufficient for conscious experience, that the brain can process and use information without that information becoming conscious. Visualize vision as having multiple components. One component processes information for conscious perception, for seeing in the ordinary sense, for having visual experiences, and another component processes information for action, for guiding behavior, for spatial navigation. And normally these components work together, are integrated, and we do not notice the distinction. But in blind sight, they separate. One component is destroyed while the other remains, and the patient has action vision without perceptual vision, can use visual information for pointing and reaching, but cannot experience that information, cannot see it. And this shows that conscious experience is not simply a byproduct of information processing, but is a specific kind of processing, localized in specific brain regions. And when those regions are damaged, consciousness is lost even though other forms of visual processing continue. The blind sight paradox challenges functionalist theories of consciousness. Theories that say consciousness is defined by functional roles, by what information does, by how it affects behavior, because in blind sight, visual information performs many of its normal functions, guides behavior, enables responses, but does not produce conscious experience. And so consciousness is not identical to function, is something additional, is a specific kind of processing beyond mere responsiveness to stimuli. And this supports theories that distinguish between access consciousness, the availability of information for cognitive processes, and phenomenal consciousness, the subjective experiential quality. And blind sight shows that these can come apart, that information can be accessed and used without being phenomenally conscious. One response to the blind sight paradox accepts that it shows consciousness is separate from certain functions, from certain kinds of information processing, but argues that this does not threaten physicalism, does not show that consciousness is non-physical, only that it is a specific physical process localized in specific brain regions. And blind sight is a case where some visual processing continues without the processing that produces conscious experience, and this is compatible with consciousness being physical, being identical to certain patterns of neural activity. And the paradox shows which patterns are necessary for consciousness, shows that primary visual cortex is essential, and this is progress in understanding the neural correlates of consciousness. Another response questions whether blind sight patients truly lack conscious experience, argues that they might have degraded or partial visual experiences that they do not recognize as vision, that do not match their expectations of what seeing should feel like. And when they say they see nothing, they mean they have no clear, vivid visual experience, but they might have vague feelings, subtle impressions that guide their guesses. And these impressions might be minimal forms of consciousness rather than pure unconscious processing, and this response denies the complete dissociation, argues that some phenomenology remains in blind sight even if it is not ordinary visual phenomenology. A third response embraces the paradox as revealing that consciousness is not necessary for many cognitive functions, that unconscious processing is far more powerful than we thought, that the mind operates largely without awareness and consciousness is only the tip of the iceberg, a small subset of mental processes, and blind sight is an extreme case, but similar dissociations occur in normal cognition, where we process information, make decisions, guide behavior without conscious awareness. And the paradox shows that consciousness, rather than being essential to cognition, is a specialized feature that occurs only in certain conditions, for certain kinds of information processing. The blind sight paradox also has implications for debates about animal consciousness, about which animals are conscious, because if information processing without consciousness is possible in humans, then it might be the norm in simpler animals. Animals might respond to stimuli, navigate environments, exhibit complex behaviors without having conscious experiences, without there being anything it is like to be them. And this makes determining animal consciousness more difficult, makes behavioral evidence insufficient, because behavior can be produced by unconscious processing, as blind sight demonstrates. The patient sits in the laboratory, the blind field tested again and again, and each time the accuracy surprises, the pointing succeeds, the guessing is correct, and the patient insists they see nothing, feel nothing, experience nothing in that region, and yet the information is there, is being used, is guiding behavior, and the paradox persists. Vision without seeing, processing without experience, function without phenomenology, and the blind sight paradox remains one of the most important phenomena in consciousness research, a real-world demonstration that conscious experience and information processing can dissociate, that the brain can use information the person does not consciously access, and that consciousness is not reducible to function, is something specific, something localized, something that can be lost while other aspects of vision remain. And the phenomenon continues to challenge theories of consciousness, continues to provide evidence about the neural basis of awareness, and continues to raise questions about what consciousness is, what purposes it serves, why it exists, and whether it is necessary for cognition or is instead a luxury, an addition, something that happens only when certain brain regions process information in certain ways. And the blind sight patient reaches into darkness and touches the object, accurate despite seeing nothing, and the paradox endures. The bystander effect. Why more witnesses mean less help. A woman screams in the street, attacked by an assailant, stabbed repeatedly over the course of 30 minutes. And dozens of neighbours hear the screams, look out their windows, witness the attack, and no one calls police, no one intervenes, no one helps, and the woman dies while witnesses watch. And this is the murder of Kitty Genovese in 1964, an event that shocked the public, that seemed to reveal something disturbing about urban indifference, about human nature, and psychologists John Darley and Bibb Latané investigated, conducted experiments to understand why bystanders fail to help, and their research revealed the bystander effect, the paradoxical finding that the presence of other witnesses decreases the likelihood that any individual will help, that the more people who witness an emergency, the less likely anyone is to intervene. And this contradicts common sense, which suggests that more witnesses mean more help, mean more potential helpers. But the psychological reality is opposite, is that responsibility diffuses across bystanders, that each assumes someone else will help. That pluralistic ignorance emerges where everyone looks to others to define the situation, and everyone concludes it must not be serious because no one else is acting, and the bystander effect reveals how social dynamics can produce collective inaction, can create situations where groups of people fail to help when any individual alone would help. And the effect has been replicated across hundreds of studies, has been demonstrated in contexts from emergencies to everyday helping, and understanding the bystander effect has practical implications for promoting helping behaviour, for overcoming diffusion of responsibility, for recognising that crowds do not guarantee help but often prevent it. Imagine witnessing an emergency. Someone collapses on the sidewalk, and you are alone, and your responsibility is clear, is unambiguous. There is no one else who could help. And so you help, you call for medical assistance, you check if the person is breathing, you do what you can, and the situation is straightforward. Responsibility is concentrated, is entirely yours. But now imagine the same situation in a crowded plaza. Dozens of people are present, all witness the collapse, and now responsibility is diffused, is distributed across all present, and you reason that someone else will help, that someone with more expertise will intervene, that surely someone has already called for help, and you look to others to see how they are reacting, and they are not panicking, are not rushing to help, and so you conclude perhaps the situation is not serious, perhaps the person is drunk rather than injured, perhaps help is not needed, and everyone reasons this way. Everyone diffuses responsibility. Everyone looks to others and no one helps. And the person lies there untended while a crowd watches. And this is the bystander effect in action, the paradoxical result that more witnesses produce less help. The bystander effect demonstrates several psychological mechanisms: diffusion of responsibility, where the presence of others makes each individual feel less personally responsible; pluralistic ignorance, where everyone looks to others to define the situation, and everyone's inaction convinces everyone else that the situation is not serious; evaluation apprehension, where people fear being embarrassed if they help inappropriately, fear looking foolish if they misinterpret the situation; and audience inhibition, where the presence of others makes people self-conscious, makes them less willing to act. And these mechanisms combine to suppress helping behaviour, to create barriers that are stronger when more people are present, and the effect is not universal, is moderated by various factors, by the ambiguity of the situation, by whether the victim and bystander are similar, by time pressure, by the relationship between bystanders, but the basic pattern is robust, is well established. More bystanders generally mean less help. Visualize the effect as an inverse relationship. As bystanders increase, helping probability decreases, and experiments show this quantitatively, show that when participants believe they are the only witness, they help more than 80% of the time. But when they believe there are 4 other witnesses, they help less than 40% of the time, and response time increases with number of bystanders. It takes longer to help when more are present, and these effects are not small, are not marginal, are dramatic reductions in helping behaviour caused simply by the presence of others, and the effect challenges the assumption that safety in numbers applies to emergencies, shows that crowds can be dangerous not because they contain threats, but because they inhibit helping. One implication of the bystander effect is for personal safety, for recognising that if you need help in an emergency, you should not appeal to groups, should not shout for someone to help, but should single out an individual, should point to a specific person and say, "You in the red shirt, call 911. And this direct assignment of responsibility overcomes diffusion, makes responsibility clear and concentrated, and significantly increases helping likelihood. And self-defense trainers teach this. Teach that calling for help requires specificity, requires breaking through the bystander effect by eliminating diffusion of responsibility. Another implication is for intervention training, for teaching people to recognize the bystander effect, to understand that their inaction contributes to collective inaction, that everyone assuming someone else will help means no one helps. An awareness of the effect increases helping behaviour, increases intervention rates, and training programs that teach about the bystander effect and provide intervention skills show effectiveness, show that educated bystanders are more likely to help, are better at recognising emergencies, are more willing to take responsibility, and many institutions now provide such training. Colleges offer bystander intervention programs. Workplaces train employees to intervene in harassment or discrimination, and understanding the psychology improves outcomes. The bystander effect also appears beyond emergencies, appears in everyday situations requiring minor helping. Someone drops papers and no one helps pick them up when many people are present. Someone struggles with a door and passers-by ignore them when others are around. And the effect generalizes, shows that diffusion of responsibility and pluralistic ignorance operate in low-stakes situations, not just in dramatic emergencies, and this suggests that the mechanisms are fundamental aspects of social psychology, are default responses to situations with potential helpers, and overcoming them requires conscious effort, requires recognizing the psychological barriers and deliberately choosing to help despite them. Some research questions the original Kitty Genovese narrative, suggests that the number of witnesses was exaggerated, that some witnesses did call police, that the story was sensationalized. And while the specific details are disputed, the bystander effect itself is real, is well documented, is not dependent on that one case, but is demonstrated across hundreds of experiments and real-world observations. And the effect remains one of the most robust findings in social psychology, remains a phenomenon that reliably occurs under controlled conditions. And questioning the Genovese case does not undermine the effect, does not invalidate the psychological mechanisms, but shows that public understanding of the case may be based on incomplete information. The effect also has limits, works differently in different cultures, is stronger in individualist cultures, and weaker in collectivist cultures, where group responsibility is more salient, is stronger in urban environments, and weaker in small communities where people know each other, is weaker when victims are similar to bystanders, when group identity is salient. And these moderators show that the effect is not inevitable, is not universal, but depends on social context, on cultural norms, on relationships. And this suggests intervention strategies, suggests that building community, creating shared identity, emphasizing collective responsibility can reduce the bystander effect, can promote helping even in groups. The woman lies in the street, bleeding, screaming, and windows light up. Faces appear, watch, and no one comes, no one calls. The witnesses assume others will help, assume the situation must not be serious if no one else is acting, and the bystander effect unfolds, responsibility diffuses, pluralistic ignorance emerges, and the woman dies while a crowd watches. And the tragedy reveals something about human psychology, reveals that helping is not automatic, is inhibited by social dynamics, is suppressed when others are present, and the bystander effect remains one of the most important findings in social psychology, remains a demonstration that individual helping decreases when groups are present, that crowds can be obstacles to help rather than sources of help. And understanding the effect is crucial for promoting intervention, for overcoming diffusion of responsibility, for ensuring that witnesses become helpers rather than passive observers. And the effect endures as a permanent warning about the social psychology of helping, about the paradox that more potential helpers often mean less actual help. And the lesson persists that helping requires overcoming social barriers, requires taking personal responsibility, despite the presence of others, requires acting when everyone else is watching and waiting. The Banach-Tarski paradox. A solid sphere can be decomposed into a finite number of pieces, which can then be reassembled, using only rotations and translations, to form two solid spheres, each identical to the original. And this seems to violate conservation of volume, seems to create matter from nothing, seems to be impossible, and yet it is a theorem in mathematics, proven rigorously using the axiom of choice and the properties of infinite point sets. And this is the Banach-Tarski paradox, named after Stefan Banach and Alfred Tarski, who proved it in 1924. And the paradox reveals deep and counterintuitive features of infinite decompositions, of non-measurable sets, and of the relationship between mathematics and physical reality. The proof proceeds by decomposing the sphere into a finite number of pieces, typically 5 or 6, and each piece is a set of points, not a solid region with smooth boundaries but a scattered, disconnected, infinitely complex collection of points. And these pieces are non-measurable, meaning they do not have well-defined volumes in the usual sense. They cannot be assigned a size using standard measure theory. And this is crucial because measurable sets cannot be duplicated. Conservation of volume holds for measurable sets, but non-measurable sets escape this constraint. They can be rearranged in ways that seem to violate intuition, and the Banach-Tarski paradox exploits this by constructing pieces that are so pathological, so wildly scattered, that they can be rotated and translated to form two complete spheres. The decomposition uses the axiom of choice, the principle that given any collection of non-empty sets, there exists a way to choose one element from each set, and the axiom of choice is independent of the other axioms of set theory. It cannot be proven or disproven from the standard axioms, and some mathematicians reject it precisely because it leads to results, like the Banach-Tarski paradox, results that seem absurd, and rejecting the axiom of choice avoids the paradox. But it also cripples large parts of modern mathematics. Many important theorems depend on the axiom of choice, and most mathematicians accept it despite its counterintuitive consequences. The paradox applies only to objects in three-dimensional space, or higher. It does not work in 2 dimensions. A disk cannot be decomposed and reassembled into 2 disks. And this is because the group of rotations in the plane is amenable, meaning it admits a certain kind of averaging that prevents paradoxical decompositions, while the group of rotations in 3-dimensional space is non-amenable, and this non-amenability is what makes the Banach-Tarski paradox possible. The fact that rotations in 3 dimensions can be combined in ways that allow pieces to be moved around and duplicated. The paradox raises questions about the relationship between mathematical objects and physical objects, because while the Banach-Tarski theorem is mathematically rigorous, it does not imply that a physical sphere can be duplicated. The decomposition involves infinitely complex sets, pieces that are not solid regions but scattered collections of points, with no smooth boundaries, and such pieces cannot be physically realized, cannot be cut or manipulated, and so the paradox is a feature of mathematical idealizations rather than a claim about physical reality. And this distinction is important. The paradox shows that mathematical spheres treated as sets of points behave in strange ways, but it does not threaten conservation of mass or energy in physics, because physical objects are not sets of points but arrangements of atoms or fields or quantum states, and these are governed by physical laws that do not permit paradoxical duplication. Some mathematicians and philosophers argue that the Banach-Tarski paradox is not really a paradox but a theorem, a surprising result that reveals features of infinite point sets and non-measurable sets, and that calling it a paradox is misleading, suggesting contradiction when there is none, only counterintuitive behavior. And from this perspective, the paradox is valuable precisely because it challenges intuition, because it shows that infinite collections have properties that finite collections lack, that measure theory has limits, that the axiom of choice has strange consequences, and that mathematics is richer and stranger than naive expectations suggest. Others find the paradox troubling, a sign that something is wrong with the foundations, that the axiom of choice should be rejected or restricted, that non-measurable sets are pathological objects that should not be admitted into mathematics, and that theories which avoid such sets, like those based on constructive or intuitionistic logic, provide better foundations. And this debate reflects deeper disagreements about the nature of mathematical existence, about what kinds of objects mathematics should study, and about the role of intuition in guiding mathematical practice. The Banach-Tarski paradox also appears in discussions of probability and decision theory, because if a sphere can be decomposed into non-measurable pieces, then probability distributions on spheres must be carefully defined to avoid assigning probabilities to non-measurable sets. And this technical requirement reflects the same underlying issue, that not all collections of points can be measured, that probability requires measurability, and that attempting to assign probabilities to arbitrary sets leads to contradictions or paradoxes. The sphere sits on the table, solid and indivisible to the eye, but mathematically it is a set of infinitely many points. And the Banach-Tarski theorem says that these points can be partitioned into pieces, 5 or 6 strange scattered collections, and these pieces can be moved, rotated and translated and reassembled into 2 spheres, identical to the original, and the volume has doubled or seems to have doubled, but the pieces never had well-defined volumes. They were never measurable, and so nothing has been created, no conservation law has been violated, only the intuition that decomposition preserves size, and this intuition holds for finite decompositions, for measurable pieces, but fails for infinite non-measurable pieces, and the paradox endures. A theorem that sounds impossible, a result that challenges understanding, a demonstration that mathematics contains surprises, that infinity is stranger than imagination, that point sets behave in ways that solid objects do not, and that the axiom of choice, innocent as it seems, permits constructions that defy common sense, and the sphere duplicates, mathematically, if not physically. And the paradox remains, a permanent fixture in the landscape of mathematics, a result that students encounter with disbelief, that mathematicians accept as rigorous yet counterintuitive, and that philosophers debate as revealing something deep about the nature of mathematical objects, about the limits of measure theory, about the relationship between infinite idealization and finite reality. And the sphere sits there, unchanged and yet somehow doubled, a monument to the strangeness of infinity, to the power of the axiom of choice, and to the capacity of mathematics to prove truths that seem like impossibilities. The consequence argument, why the past makes your future inevitable. A philosopher constructs a deceptively simple argument about free will and determinism, an argument that has become one of the most influential and most discussed arguments in the free will debate. And the argument is called the consequence argument, formulated most clearly by Peter van Inwagen. And the argument aims to show that free will is incompatible with determinism, that if determinism is true, then no one has free will, that our actions are not genuinely up to us but are consequences of the past and the laws of nature, things we cannot control, and the argument proceeds through careful reasoning about what we can and cannot control, about what is and is not up to us, and it concludes that if the past and the laws determine everything, then we determine nothing. We have no control. We are not free. And this is the consequence argument, an argument for incompatibilism, for the view that determinism and free will cannot both be true, and the argument forces compatibilists to explain how we could be free if determinism is true, how our actions could be up to us if they are inevitable consequences of factors beyond our control. And the debate sparked by this argument continues, with philosophers proposing responses, defending premises, clarifying concepts, and the consequence argument remains central to contemporary discussions of free will, a challenge that every theory must address. Imagine the logical structure. Determinism says that the state of the world at any time, plus the laws of nature, entail the state of the world at all future times. Everything that happens is a consequence of what happened before, plus the laws. And now consider your action right now. Reading these words, and if determinism is true, then this action is entailed by the state of the world before you were born, plus the laws of nature, and you have no control over the state of the world before you were born. You did not cause it. You cannot change it. It is a fixed fact about the past, and you have no control over the laws of nature. You did not create them. You cannot alter them. They are what they are, independent of you. And if your action is entailed by things you have no control over, then you have no control over your action. And if you have no control over your action, then you are not free with respect to that action. And this applies to all your actions. All are consequences of the past and the laws, things beyond your control. And so if determinism is true, then you are not free. You have no free will. And this is the consequence argument in its essential form. The argument can be stated more formally using the concept of power, what we have power over, what is up to us. And the argument says that no one has power over the past, no one has power over the laws of nature, no one has power over the fact that the past and the laws entail the present. And therefore, by a transfer principle, if the present is entailed by things we have no power over, then we have no power over the present. And having power over our actions is necessary for free will, and so we lack free will. If determinism is true, and the argument is valid, the conclusion follows from the premises. And so attacking the argument requires attacking one of the premises, requires either denying that we lack power over the past and laws, which seems implausible, or denying the transfer principle, denying that lack of power transfers across entailment. Visualize the causal chain, stretching back into the past, the state of the universe billions of years ago, plus the laws of physics determined the state 1 second later, and that state, plus the laws determined the next state. And the chain continues, moment by moment, through the formation of galaxies and stars and planets, through the evolution of life, through human history, through your birth and upbringing and this present moment. And at no point in this chain did you have control. You were not there at the beginning. You did not set the initial conditions. You did not write the laws, and the entire chain was set in motion before you existed. And your current action is the end of this chain, is the inevitable consequence of factors you did not control. And the consequence argument says, this shows you are not free. Your action was not genuinely up to you, was determined by the past. Compatibilists respond to the consequence argument in various ways. One response denies the transfer principle, argues that lack of power does not transfer across entailment in the way the argument assumes, that you can have power over a fact even if that fact is entailed by other facts you have no power over. And this response requires specifying what power means, what it is to have something be up to you. And compatibilists argue that an action is up to you if it results from your deliberation, your desires, your character, even if those psychological states were themselves determined by the past. And so the transfer principle is false. Power does not transfer, and the consequence argument fails. Another compatibilist response accepts the transfer principle, but denies that we lack power over the past in the relevant sense, argues that we do have a kind of counterfactual power over the past. We have the power such that if we had chosen differently, then the past would have been different. And this counterfactual power is sufficient for freedom, sufficient for the action to be up to us. And critics respond that counterfactual power is not real power, that being such that if you acted differently, the past would have been different is not the same as being able to act differently. And the compatibilist response confuses conditional ability with genuine ability, confuses what would have happened if things were different with what you can make happen. A third compatibilist response distinguishes between freedom and ultimate responsibility, accepts that the consequence argument shows we lack ultimate responsibility, ultimate control, the kind of control that would make us solely and completely responsible for our actions independent of all prior causes, but argues that we have enough control, enough freedom, for moral responsibility, for being proper subjects of praise and blame, and ultimate responsibility is impossible, is not required for the ordinary kind of responsibility that matters for ethics and law. And the consequence argument shows too much, shows that even libertarians who reject determinism cannot have ultimate responsibility because their actions are either caused by prior states or are random, and neither causation nor randomness gives ultimate responsibility. And so, the consequence argument does not distinguish between compatibilism and libertarianism, does not favour incompatibilism over compatibilism. Incompatibilists defend the consequence argument, defend the transfer principle, argue that compatibilist responses involve sophisticated verbal tricks, redefine freedom in ways that evacuate it of meaning, and the consequence argument reveals that if determinism is true, then we are not truly in control, are not genuinely free, and moral responsibility is undermined. And we must either reject determinism or accept that free will is an illusion, and different incompatibilists choose differently. Some become libertarians and argue that determinism is false, that quantum mechanics or agent causation or emergent properties provide room for free will, and others become hard determinists and accept that free will does not exist, that responsibility is problematic, that praise and blame need reinterpretation. The consequence argument also generates discussions about the fixity of the past, about what it means to say we have no power over the past. Because in one sense this is obvious. We cannot change what has already happened, cannot make it the case that the past was different. But in another sense, our current actions do affect what the past was, because if we act differently now, then the past must have been different given determinism. And so there is a sense in which our actions constrain the past, and compatibilists exploit this to argue that we do have power over the past in the relevant sense, while incompatibilists insist that this is not real power, not the kind of control required for freedom. The argument stands at the centre of free will debates, forces clarification of concepts, forces philosophers to specify what freedom requires, what control means, what power involves, and whether these are compatible with determinism, and the debate is productive, generates insight, even if it does not generate consensus, and the consequence argument remains one of the most powerful arguments for incompatibilism. One of the most difficult challenges for compatibilists to answer, and Van Inwagen's formulation is elegant, is compelling, captures a deep intuition that if everything we do is the inevitable consequence of factors beyond our control, then we are not truly free and the past stretches back, determined and fixed, and the laws operate, inexorable and unchanging, and the present unfolds and the action occurs. And the consequence argument says, this action was not free, was not genuinely up to the agent, was a consequence of things beyond control. And whether this argument succeeds, whether compatibilists can answer it, remains disputed, remains central to contemporary philosophy of free will. The crocodile dilemma, when a monster's promise makes truth deadly. A crocodile seizes a child from the riverbank, snatches the infant in its jaws, and the mother screams and begs for her child's return, and the crocodile, cunning and cruel, makes an offer. The crocodile says, "I will return your child if you correctly predict what I will do, if you say truly whether I will return the child or not." And the mother must choose, must predict the crocodile's action, and if she predicts correctly, she gets her child back. And if she predicts incorrectly, the crocodile keeps the child. And this seems straightforward at first, seems like a gamble with 50-50 odds. But the mother is clever, thinks carefully, and realizes she can construct a prediction that creates a paradox. And she says to the crocodile, "You will not return my child." And now the crocodile faces an impossible choice, a logical trap from which there is no escape. And this is the crocodile dilemma, an ancient paradox from Greek and Roman philosophy that illustrates how self-reference and promises can generate contradictions that have no resolution. Imagine the crocodile processing the mother's prediction. She has said, the crocodile will not return the child, and the crocodile must decide whether this prediction is true or false. And if the prediction is true, then the crocodile will not return the child, but the promise was to return the child. If the prediction is correct, and the prediction is correct, so the crocodile must return the child. But returning the child makes the prediction false, because the prediction said the child would not be returned. And if the prediction is false, then the crocodile is not obligated to return the child, but not returning the child makes the prediction true. And if it is true, the crocodile must return the child, and the cycle repeats. And the crocodile is stuck, unable to act, unable to fulfill the promise without violating it, unable to violate it without fulfilling it, and the paradox is complete. Visualize the crocodile frozen at the water's edge, jaws clamped around the child, mind caught in a logical loop, every option leading to contradiction, and the mother waits, and the crocodile cannot move forward or backward, cannot return the child or keep the child without creating impossibility. And the promise that seemed simple, seemed like a straightforward conditional, has become a trap, has revealed that some promises are unkeepable, some conditionals are incoherent when their conditions refer to their own fulfillment. The dilemma is structurally similar to the liar paradox, involves self-reference creating contradiction, because the mother's prediction refers to the crocodile's action, and the crocodile's action depends on whether the prediction is true, and the prediction's truth depends on the action. And this circular dependency creates a situation where no consistent assignment of truth values is possible, where any choice by the crocodile contradicts the conditions of the promise. And the paradox shows that not all promises can be kept, not all conditionals can be satisfied, especially when the condition refers to the action that depends on the condition. One proposed resolution is that the crocodile's promise is defective, is not a genuine promise, but a linguistic trick, because promises must be performable, must create obligations that can be fulfilled, and the crocodile's promise creates an obligation that cannot be fulfilled when the mother makes the strategic prediction, and so the promise is void. The crocodile is not bound by it, and the crocodile can do whatever it chooses without violating any obligation, and by this resolution, the crocodile keeps the child. The mother loses. Not because her prediction was wrong, but because she made a prediction that made the promise unenforceable, and the dilemma is resolved by rejecting the premise that the promise binds the crocodile in paradoxical cases. Another resolution distinguishes between the crocodile's intentions at the moment of making the promise and the actual outcome, and argues that the promise should be interpreted as concerning the crocodile's intended action, not the final action after considering the prediction, and when the mother predicts the child will not be returned, the crocodile evaluates whether to intend to return the child, and if the crocodile's initial intention is not to return the child, then the prediction is correct, and the crocodile should return the child according to the promise. And this return action does not create a contradiction, because the promise was about the intention, not about the final action. But this resolution seems strained, seems to reinterpret the promise in ways that were not clearly intended. And it is not obvious that distinguishing intention from action resolves the paradox or merely shifts it. A third resolution embraces the paradox and argues that it shows the limits of what can be promised, that some conditionals are inherently problematic, that promises whose conditions involve self-reference or depend on the promise's response to the condition create logical tangles that cannot be resolved, and rational agents should avoid making such promises, should recognize that not every grammatically well-formed conditional statement creates a genuine obligation, and the crocodile's mistake was offering a promise whose structure allowed paradoxical predictions. And once the paradox emerges, the crocodile is released from the promise, is in a situation where any action is permissible because no action can satisfy the promise, and morality and logic give no guidance. The crocodile dilemma also illustrates issues in game theory and strategic reasoning, because the mother is using her prediction strategically, choosing her words not to convey her genuine belief about what the crocodile will do, but to create a situation where the crocodile cannot win. And this strategic use of language, using predictions not to predict, but to constrain, appears in negotiations, legal arguments, and political discourse, where statements are crafted to create binds, to force opponents into positions where any response is disadvantageous, and the dilemma shows that self-referential statements can be weapons, can be used to trap others in paradoxes where no good option exists. The dilemma has modern variants involving computers and artificial intelligence, where programs might be given instructions that are self-referential, that depend on the program's own output in ways that create paradox, and programmers must be careful to avoid such loops, must ensure that conditionals do not refer to their own evaluation in ways that create infinite regress or contradiction. And the crocodile dilemma serves as a warning, a reminder that self-reference is dangerous, creates problems that cannot always be resolved by cleverness or by trying harder, but only by recognizing the structure and avoiding it. The child hangs in the crocodile's jaws. The mother waits for an answer, and the crocodile is paralyzed by logic, cannot move without contradiction, and the ancient paradox remains, unsolved, unresolvable, a trap that philosophy has not escaped, a reminder that language can create impossibilities, that promises can be unkeepable, that self-reference generates paradoxes that defy solution, and the crocodile dilemma endures, taught in logic classes, discussed in philosophy seminars, a vivid example of how words can bind more tightly than chains, how a simple promise can become an impossible obligation, and how the combination of self-reference and conditionality creates contradictions from which there is no escape, and the crocodile remains frozen, the child unclaimed, and the paradox persists, waiting at the riverbank for the next clever victim to spring the trap. The Euthyphro dilemma. Is murder wrong because God says so, or does God say so because it's wrong? In ancient Athens, a young man named Euthyphro encounters Socrates on the steps of the courthouse, and Euthyphro is prosecuting his own father for murder. And Socrates, ever curious, asks Euthyphro to explain what piety is, what makes an action holy or righteous. And Euthyphro confidently responds that pious actions are those loved by the gods, and impious actions are those hated by the gods. And Socrates, never satisfied with simple answers, poses a question that has echoed through philosophy and theology for over 2,000 years. He asks whether the gods love pious actions because those actions are pious, or whether actions are pious because the gods love them. And this question, now called the Euthyphro dilemma, presents a fundamental challenge to divine command theory. The view that morality depends on God's will, that actions are right or wrong because God commands or forbids them, and the dilemma forces a choice between two uncomfortable options, each with troubling implications for the relationship between God and morality. Imagine the first horn of the dilemma. Suppose that actions are good because God commands them, that rightness is simply whatever God says is right, and wrongness is whatever God forbids, and there is no independent standard of goodness, no morality that exists prior to or apart from God's commands. And God could have commanded anything, could have made murder obligatory and charity forbidden, could have declared torture virtuous and compassion wicked, and whatever God commanded would be right by definition. And this seems to make morality arbitrary, seems to empty moral terms of their content. Because if good just means commanded by God, then saying God commands what is good becomes a tautology, becomes equivalent to saying God commands what God commands, which is trivial, tells us nothing, and more troublingly, this view seems to undermine the idea that God is good, because if goodness is defined by God's commands, then calling God good just means God does what God commands, which again is trivial, and we lose the ability to praise God's goodness as something meaningful, as something that transcends mere consistency with divine will. Visualize a world where this view is true, where morality is purely a matter of divine fiat, and God announces new commandments, declares that from now on, stealing is virtuous and honesty is sin, and according to divine command theory, this announcement would make stealing right and honesty wrong, because rightness just is whatever God says, and we would be obligated to become thieves, obligated to lie, and this seems absurd, seems to violate our deepest moral intuitions, because we feel that stealing and lying are wrong for reasons that have nothing to do with commands, that they harm people, violate trust, undermine cooperation, and these reasons would exist even if God commanded otherwise, and so morality seems to have a structure, a logic that cannot be altered by divine decree. And this suggests that the first horn of the dilemma is unacceptable, that we should reject the idea that actions are good merely because God commands them. Now consider the second horn. Suppose that God commands actions because those actions are good, that there is an independent standard of goodness, a moral truth that exists prior to God's commands. And God, being perfectly good and perfectly wise, recognizes this moral truth and commands accordingly. And God commands charity because charity is good, forbids murder because murder is bad, and the goodness and badness exist independently of the commands. And this seems more plausible, seems to preserve the meaningfulness of moral language and the praiseworthiness of God's goodness. But it creates a different problem, because if moral truth is independent of God, then God is not the ultimate source of morality. God does not create right and wrong, but merely recognizes and reveals them. And there is something above God, a standard of goodness to which even God is subject. And this seems to limit God's sovereignty, seems to place constraints on divine power and authority. And many theologians find this unacceptable, argue that nothing can be above God, that God is the ultimate reality, the ground of all being, and making morality independent of God seems to dethrone God, to reduce God to a mere messenger of moral truths that exist on their own. The dilemma presents a forced choice: either accept that morality is arbitrary, dependent on God's will, capable of being anything God decrees, or accept that morality is independent of God, existing prior to divine commands, limiting God's sovereignty. And neither option is attractive to believers who want to say both that God is the source of morality and that God's commands reflect genuine moral truth rather than arbitrary preference. And various theological and philosophical responses have been proposed over the centuries, attempting to escape between the horns to find a position that preserves both divine sovereignty and moral objectivity. One response associated with medieval theologians like Duns Scotus embraces the first horn, accepts that morality depends entirely on God's will, and bites the bullet on arbitrariness, arguing that God's commands are not arbitrary in any problematic sense because God is perfectly rational and benevolent. And while God could have commanded otherwise, God would never do so. And God's nature ensures that divine commands will align with what promotes flourishing and well-being. And so while morality is ultimately grounded in God's will, it is not random or capricious. And this response tries to have it both ways, tries to say that morality depends on God's will, but is still stable and reasonable because God's character is stable and reasonable. But critics argue that this just pushes the problem back, because now we are saying God's character is good. And what does good mean here? If goodness is defined by God's will, then saying God's character is good is circular. And if goodness is independent, then we are back on the second horn. Another response associated with Aquinas and natural law theory embraces the second horn but softens it, argues that moral truth is not independent of God but is part of God's nature, is rooted in the divine essence, and God's commands reflect God's eternal nature rather than arbitrary choices. And goodness is not external to God but internal, is what God is, and God commands what is good because God is goodness itself. And this unites God and morality, makes them inseparable, avoids both arbitrariness and external constraint. But critics argue that this is just wordplay, that if moral truth is part of God's nature, then it is still independent in the relevant sense, still not something God creates or controls, and the question remains whether God could have had a different nature. And if so, we are back to arbitrariness. And if not, then something constrains God's nature, something makes God's nature what it is, and we are back to external constraints. A third response from some modern philosophers rejects the dilemma entirely, argues that it presents a false choice, that it assumes moral realism, assumes that moral truths exist objectively, either dependent on God or independent, but perhaps moral truth is neither. Perhaps morality is a human construction, a set of norms we create to facilitate cooperation, and God's role is to guide this construction, to reveal which norms best serve human flourishing, and this avoids both horns by denying the assumption that moral truth exists in any absolute sense, but it creates new problems, makes morality relative or subjective, undermines the claim that moral truths are objective facts that God knows and humans can discover, and many find this solution worse than the original dilemma. The Euthyphro dilemma appears not just in theology, but in secular ethics as well, because any attempt to ground morality in authority faces the same structure. If we say actions are right because society approves them, we can ask whether society approves them because they are right, or whether they are right because society approves them. And the dilemma recurs: arbitrariness on one side, independent moral truth on the other. And the same choice must be faced. And this suggests that the dilemma is not specifically about God, but about the relationship between authority and morality, about whether moral truth can be grounded in will, in decision, in command, or whether it must exist independently of any authority, answerable to reason or nature or some other source. Socrates stands on the courthouse steps, questioning Euthyphro, probing the foundations of piety, and the young man's confidence wavers. His simple answer unravels, and the dilemma emerges, stark and unavoidable. And 25 centuries later, the question remains: does God command the good because it is good, or is it good because God commands it? And theologians and philosophers continue to debate, continue to propose solutions, continue to struggle with a choice that seems to force a sacrifice, either God's sovereignty or morality's objectivity, either divine authority or moral truth. And the dilemma persists, unresolved, a permanent fixture in philosophy of religion, a challenge to anyone who wants to ground ethics in divine will, and a reminder that even the most fundamental questions about the source of right and wrong, about the relationship between God and goodness, about whether morality is created or discovered, remain open, remain contested, and the young Euthyphro walks away confused, and Socrates continues to question, and the dilemma remains, waiting to challenge every new generation of believers and philosophers who confront the ancient problem of how God and morality relate. The EPR paradox: when particles know what their partners are doing. Two particles are created together in a quantum process, perhaps two photons emitted from a single atom, or two electrons produced in a pair, and these particles fly apart in opposite directions, travelling far from each other, perhaps to opposite ends of a laboratory, or even to different planets. And quantum mechanics predicts that these particles remain connected, entangled, in a way that defies classical intuition, because measuring a property of one particle instantly affects the other particle, no matter how far apart they are, and the measurement outcomes are correlated in ways that cannot be explained by assuming each particle carried definite properties from the beginning. And this is the EPR paradox, named after Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen, who presented it in 1935 as an argument that quantum mechanics is incomplete, that there must be hidden variables, additional information not captured by the quantum wave function that determines the outcomes of measurements and explains the correlations without requiring instantaneous action at a distance. Imagine the scenario more concretely. Two particles are entangled such that they have opposite spins. If one is measured to have spin up, then the other will definitely be measured to have spin down, and vice versa. And this correlation is perfect, 100%, whenever both particles are measured along the same axis. And before measurement, quantum mechanics describes each particle as being in a superposition of spin up and spin down. neither definite, and the two particles together are described by an entangled state that cannot be factored into separate descriptions of each particle. The state is inherently joint, and when one particle is measured and found to be spin up, the other particle's state immediately becomes spin down, even if the two particles are light years apart. And this instantaneous correlation troubled Einstein, who called it spooky action at a distance, and argued that it violated the principle of locality, the idea that physical influences cannot travel faster than light, that distant events cannot have immediate effects. Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen proposed that quantum mechanics is incomplete, that each particle must carry hidden information, hidden variables that determine what the measurement outcomes will be, and these hidden variables are fixed at the moment the particles are created. And so when the particles are measured later, the outcomes are determined by these pre-existing properties, not by any instantaneous influence. And the correlation between the particles is explained by the fact that they started with correlated hidden variables, like two coins that were both set to heads when they left your hand and remain heads as they fly through the air. And when you look at them later, you find them both showing heads. And this correlation does not require any spooky action, just common initial conditions. And EPR argued that quantum mechanics, which does not include these hidden variables, gives an incomplete description of reality. For decades, the EPR argument was a philosophical debate, a question about interpretation and the nature of quantum mechanics. But in 1964, physicist John Bell proved a theorem that transformed the debate into an experimental question. Bell showed that any theory based on local hidden variables, any theory where measurement outcomes are determined by pre-existing properties and where influences travel at or below the speed of light, must satisfy certain mathematical inequalities, now called Bell inequalities, and these inequalities place limits on how strongly the measurement outcomes of two distant particles can be correlated. And Bell showed that quantum mechanics predicts correlations that violate these inequalities, that quantum correlations are stronger than any local hidden variable theory can produce. And so by performing experiments and measuring the correlations, one can test whether nature obeys the Bell inequalities, and if the inequalities are violated, then local hidden variables are ruled out, and quantum mechanics, with its spooky action at a distance, is vindicated. Experiments have been performed many times with increasing sophistication and precision, closing various loopholes, and the results consistently show violations of Bell inequalities, strong correlations that match quantum mechanical predictions, and rule out local hidden variable theories. And so nature does not obey locality in the way Einstein wanted. The particles really are entangled, and measuring one really does instantaneously affect the other. And this is now an established experimental fact, one of the most thoroughly tested predictions in physics, and the EPR paradox has been resolved in favour of quantum mechanics against Einstein's intuitions, though the philosophical implications remain deeply puzzling. The paradox forces a choice between giving up locality or giving up realism, the idea that physical properties have definite values independent of measurement, and most interpretations of quantum mechanics give up realism, accepting that particles do not have definite spin values until measured, that the spin only becomes definite through the act of measurement, and the entanglement means that the two particles are not independent. They form a single quantum system even when separated by vast distances, and measuring one particle provides information about the system as a whole, and this information is reflected in the state of the other particle. But this does not allow faster-than-light communication, because the measurement outcomes are random. Neither particle can control what value it will be measured to have, and so no message can be sent. Only correlations can be observed after the fact by comparing measurement records. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics, like Bohmian mechanics, preserve realism by giving up locality, introducing non-local hidden variables that allow instantaneous influences, pilot waves, that guide particles in ways that depend on the entire configuration of the universe. And these theories reproduce the predictions of quantum mechanics and are empirically equivalent, but they are non-local. They violate Einstein's principle that influences cannot propagate faster than light. And most physicists find this cost too high, prefer to accept that realism must be given up, that particles do not have definite properties until measured. Visualize the two entangled particles flying apart, one heading left and one heading right, and they are described by a single wave function. An entangled state that says, if left is up, then right is down, and if left is down, then right is up, but neither is definite until measured. And now imagine measuring the left particle and finding it spin up, and at that instant, even though the right particle is far away, its state changes. It becomes definitely spin down, and if someone measures the right particle immediately after, they will definitely find spin down. And this correlation holds no matter how far apart the particles are, no matter how quickly the measurements are performed, as long as they are performed along the same axis. And this instantaneous correlation cannot be explained by assuming the particles carry definite spins from the beginning. Bell's theorem proves that, and so the correlation is genuinely quantum, genuinely non-local, genuinely spooky. And yet it does not allow signaling, does not allow information to be sent faster than light, because the outcomes are random and cannot be controlled. The EPR paradox stands as one of the deepest puzzles in quantum mechanics, a paradox that led to Bell's theorem, to decades of experimental tests, to the confirmation of quantum non-locality, and to ongoing debates about what quantum mechanics means, about whether reality is fundamentally non-local, about whether measurement is a special process or an ordinary interaction, about whether consciousness plays a role, about whether the universe splits into branches or whether hidden variables exist beyond our current theories, and none of these questions has a settled answer. Different physicists and philosophers hold different views, and the EPR paradox remains a touchstone, a thought experiment that crystallizes the central mysteries of quantum theory. And Einstein's discomfort with spooky action at a distance, his belief that quantum mechanics must be incomplete, has been answered by experiment. Nature really is spooky. Particles really are entangled. Measurements really do have instantaneous non-local effects. And this is not a failure of the theory, but a feature of reality, a feature that defies classical intuition and forces us to accept that the quantum world operates according to rules that seem impossible, that violate locality, that create correlations stronger than any classical mechanism can produce. And the paradox endures, not as an unsolved problem, but as a solved problem with an unsettling answer. And the particles fly apart, entangled forever, connected by invisible quantum threads, and measuring one affects the other instantly, across any distance, and the universe is non-local. And the EPR paradox, intended to show that quantum mechanics is incomplete, instead revealed that nature is stranger than Einstein imagined. The Fermi paradox. Where is everybody in this crowded universe? The Milky Way galaxy contains hundreds of billions of stars, many with planets, and our galaxy is one of hundreds of billions of galaxies in the observable universe. And Earth formed about 4.5 billion years ago, relatively late in cosmic history, and life emerged within 1 billion years, and intelligence and technology developed recently. And these facts suggest that Earth is not special, that the conditions that led to life here should occur elsewhere, and if even a tiny fraction of planets develop intelligent civilizations, and if even a small percentage of those civilizations develop technology capable of space travel or interstellar communication, then the galaxy should be teeming with evidence of alien intelligence. We should see their radio signals, their spacecraft, their structures, their influence on stars and planets, and yet we see nothing, hear nothing, find no evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence despite decades of searching, despite scanning the skies with radio telescopes, despite analysing thousands of exoplanets. And this silence, this absence of evidence, is the Fermi paradox, named after physicist Enrico Fermi, who reportedly asked during a lunch conversation in 1950, "Where is everybody?" And this question, simple and childlike, conceals one of the deepest puzzles in science, the question of whether we are alone in the universe, or whether alien civilizations exist but remain undetected for reasons we do not yet understand. The paradox can be stated more precisely through the Drake equation, an attempt to estimate the number of communicating civilizations in our galaxy. The equation multiplies together several factors: the rate of star formation, the fraction of stars with planets, the number of habitable planets per star system, the fraction of habitable planets where life emerges, the fraction of life-bearing planets where intelligence evolves, the fraction of intelligent species that develop technology, and the lifetime of technological civilizations. And depending on the values assigned to these factors, the equation predicts anywhere from 0 civilizations besides us to millions, and optimistic estimates suggest thousands or millions of alien civilizations should exist in our galaxy alone. And over billions of years, some of these civilizations should have spread through the galaxy, colonizing stars, building structures, leaving traces, and yet we see nothing. And this gap between expectation and observation is the Fermi paradox. Various explanations have been proposed, grouped into several categories. One possibility is that intelligent life is extraordinarily rare, that one or more factors in the Drake equation is much smaller than optimistic estimates suggest. Perhaps the emergence of life is a rare event. Perhaps the evolution of complex multicellular organisms requires unlikely coincidences. Perhaps intelligence is not an inevitable outcome of evolution, but a fluke that happened once on Earth and nowhere else. And if intelligence is sufficiently rare, then perhaps we are the first or among the first civilizations in the galaxy, and the silence is explained by our being early arrivals, alone for now, but perhaps not forever. Another category of explanations invokes the Great Filter, a hypothetical barrier that prevents civilizations from reaching the stage where they are detectable across interstellar distances. And the filter could be in our past, something that makes the emergence of intelligence extremely difficult, in which case humanity has passed the filter and the future is open, or the filter could be in our future, a challenge that civilizations face and almost always fail. Perhaps self-destruction through war or environmental collapse, perhaps technological stagnation, perhaps a transition that seems likely but proves fatal. And if the great filter lies ahead, then our survival is not guaranteed, and the silence of the cosmos is ominous, a warning that intelligence tends toward extinction. A third category suggests that civilizations exist but remain undetected for various reasons. Perhaps they communicate using technologies we have not discovered. Perhaps they deliberately hide to avoid contact with younger civilizations. Perhaps they exist in forms we would not recognize as life or intelligence. Perhaps they transcend physical form and migrate into cyberspace or other dimensions. Or perhaps the distances and timescales involved are so vast that civilizations exist but are separated by millions of light years and billions of years, arising and falling in isolation, never overlapping in space and time, and so contact is impossible. Not because civilizations do not exist, but because the universe is too big and time is too long. Visualize the galaxy as a vast ocean, and civilizations as islands, separated by light years of empty space, and each island has a brief window of technological activity, a few thousand years perhaps, before collapse or transformation, and the ocean is so large and the windows so brief that the probability of two civilizations existing simultaneously within communication range is vanishingly small. And so each civilization looks out, sees emptiness, hears silence, and concludes it is alone. And yet across the galaxy and across time many such civilizations exist, but they never meet, never communicate, never know each other, and the Fermi paradox is resolved not by the absence of life, but by the impossibility of contact. Another explanation, more speculative, suggests that we are living in a simulation, that the observable universe is a computational construct created by an advanced civilization and the silence is programmed. No other civilizations are simulated because the creators are interested only in studying us, or because simulating multiple civilizations is too computationally expensive. And this explanation, while unfalsifiable, is logically possible and provides a clean resolution to the paradox, though it raises new questions about the nature of the simulators and their purposes. The Fermi paradox has practical implications for the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, for SETI programs that scan the skies for radio signals, for astrobiology missions that search for life on Mars or the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, and for the question of whether humanity should attempt to contact alien civilizations or remain silent. Because if the great filter lies ahead, if civilizations typically self-destruct or face existential dangers, then advertising our presence might be risky, might attract attention from hostile or indifferent intelligences, and the silence of the cosmos might be a survival strategy, a lesson learned by civilizations that survive, and if so, then broadcasting our existence might be foolish, might mark us for extinction or exploitation. The paradox also touches on philosophy and the meaning of human existence, because if we are alone, if no other intelligence exists anywhere in the observable universe, then humanity carries a unique responsibility. We are the universe's only way of understanding itself, the only conscious observers, the only beings capable of science and art and love, and the future of consciousness depends on us, on whether we survive and spread. And this realization, far from being comforting, is terrifying, because it places an enormous burden on a species that has barely begun to leave its home planet. And if we fail, if we destroy ourselves, the universe returns to darkness, to unconsciousness, to a vast emptiness where stars burn and galaxies collide. But no one watches, no one cares, no one knows. The stars shine silent and distant, and we listen, and we hear nothing, and the silence stretches across billions of light years, across billions of years, and Fermi's question echoes, where is everybody? Where are the aliens? Where are the civilizations that should exist, that must exist, that the numbers say should exist, and the answer does not come? And the paradox remains unresolved, pressing, urgent, a question that haunts astronomers and philosophers, a mystery that drives the search for life beyond Earth, and a reminder that despite all our knowledge, despite all our telescopes and equations, we do not know whether we are alone or whether the universe teems with life. And the silence, profound and unbroken, waits, and we wonder and we search, and the paradox persists. The fixity of the past, why yesterday traps today. A philosopher asserts a principle that seems undeniable, seems like one of the most obvious truths about time, and the principle is that the past is fixed, is unchangeable, is beyond our power to affect, and what has happened, cannot be made not to have happened, and no one can change the past, can reach back through time to alter what occurred, and this fixity of the past seems like a fundamental constraint on agency, seems to limit what we can do, and yet this apparently obvious principle creates puzzles when combined with other beliefs about causation and freedom. Because if the past is fixed, and if determinism is true, then the present is also fixed, is determined by the past, and if the present is fixed, then our actions are fixed, are not up to us, are not within our control, and the fixity of the past combined with determinism leads to the conclusion that we are not free, that everything we do was already settled by factors beyond our control, and this is the fixity of the past problem, the puzzle about how the unchangeability of the past constrains present freedom, about whether fixity transfers from past to present under determinism, about whether we can have power over facts that are determined by fixed facts. And this problem is closely related to the consequence argument and the transfer principle, and resolves in similar ways, with compatibilists denying that fixity transfers and incompatibilists insisting that it does, and the fixity of the past stands as another battleground in the free will debate. Imagine the past as a vast record, every event that has ever occurred inscribed permanently, unchangeably, and this record determines, through the laws of nature, everything that will occur, everything you will do. And the record was written before you were born, was fixed billions of years ago when the universe began, and you came into existence within a universe whose future was already determined by its past, and nothing you can do can change that record, can alter what has already happened. And so nothing you can do can alter what will happen, because what will happen is fixed by what has happened, and the fixity of the past extends forward through deterministic causation to create fixity of the future. And if the future is fixed, then freedom is impossible. Then your actions are not up to you, are not within your power, are settled independently of your will. And this reasoning seems compelling, seems to show that determinism plus fixity of past equals no freedom. The fixity of the past can be formulated as a principle. For any fact about the past, no one has power over whether that fact obtained. No one can make it the case that the past was different from how it actually was, and this principle is sometimes called the necessity of the past. Though necessity is a confusing term here, because the past is not logically necessary, is not necessary in all possible worlds, but is only fixed in the sense that we cannot change it, cannot affect it retroactively, and the past is settled, is beyond our control. And this settledness seems to spread forward under determinism, seems to make the present also settled, also beyond our control, and freedom disappears, is eliminated by the fixity of the past combined with deterministic causation. Visualize time as a line. The past extends behind, fixed and unchangeable, and the present is the moving point, and the future extends ahead. And if determinism is true, then the future is just as determined as the past is settled by past plus laws. And the only difference between past and future is epistemic. We know the past and do not know the future, but metaphysically they are equivalent, both determined, both fixed, and if we lack power over the past, then we also lack power over the future, because the future is determined by the past, and power does not extend across determination. And so the fixity of the past proves that determinism eliminates freedom. Compatibilists respond to fixity arguments in various ways. One response distinguishes between two kinds of fixity: what is fixed in the sense of being unchangeable retroactively, and what is fixed in the sense of being determined, and argues that while the past is fixed in the first sense, we have no power to go back and change it. The present is not fixed in the first sense, is not in the past, and our current actions determine what the present is. And so we have power over the present, even though we lack power over the past. And the two kinds of fixity are different. And the fixity of the past does not transfer to the present in the way incompatibilists claim. Another compatibilist response appeals to counterfactual power, argues that even though the past is fixed, we have the power such that if we had chosen differently, then the past would have been different. And this counterfactual power is sufficient for freedom, is what matters for responsibility, and the fixity of the past is compatible with our having counterfactual power over the present. And so determinism does not eliminate freedom, and the fixity of the past does not transfer to the present in any sense that threatens freedom. A third compatibilist response accepts that the past is fixed but denies that determinism makes the present fixed in any problematic sense, argues that being determined by the past is not the same as being beyond our control, that our choices are part of the causal chain from past to present, are among the factors that determine what happens, and having our choices be determining factors is what control consists in, is what makes actions up to us. And the fixity of the past is irrelevant, because what matters is not whether the past could have been different, but whether our current choices make a difference. And they do. They determine outcomes. and this is sufficient for freedom. Incompatibilists reject these compatibilist responses, argue that they involve verbal tricks, equivocations on power and control that obscure the real issue. And the real issue is that if the past is fixed and determines the present, then the present is also fixed, is not genuinely open, is not within our control in any sense that matters for responsibility, and compatibilist power is not real power, is a redefinition designed to make freedom compatible with determinism, and the fixity of the past, properly understood, shows that determinism eliminates genuine freedom, eliminates the kind of control required for moral responsibility. The fixity of the past also raises questions about time travel, about whether it is possible to change the past, and most philosophers accept that backward causation is impossible, that we cannot travel back and alter what occurred, because this would create paradoxes, would make it possible for you to prevent your own birth by killing your grandfather before your parents met. And such paradoxes show that the past must be fixed, must be immune to retroactive alteration. But some philosophers argue that time travel is possible as long as it is consistent, as long as any effects you have in the past are already part of the past, as it actually occurred, and this allows time travel without paradox, but requires giving up the idea that you could change the past, could make it different. And this reinforces the fixity of the past, shows that even time travel does not give power over the past. The past sits behind us, vast and unchangeable, every event recorded, every cause set in motion, and the causal chains extend from past to present, determine what is happening now, determine what you're doing, and the fixity of the past. The unchangeability of what has happened seems to make your present action also unchangeable, also fixed, also beyond your control, because if the past could not have been different, and if the past determines the present, then the present could not have been different, and you could not have done otherwise, and freedom is lost, is eliminated by the combination of fixity and determinism. And the fixity of the past remains a central problem for compatibilism, remains a challenge to explain how we can be free if our actions are determined by a past we cannot change. And the answers compatibilists offer remain controversial, remain rejected by incompatibilists who insist that fixity transfers, that unchangeability spreads from past to present under determinism, and the fixity of the past endures as a fundamental constraint on agency, a feature of time that shapes what we can and cannot do. And whether this feature eliminates freedom or merely defines its boundaries remains one of the central questions in philosophy of free will. The frozen time paradox. Time flows, or so it seems, carrying events from past to present to future in an unbroken stream. Yet what if time could stop? What if every process in the universe froze for a moment, or an hour, or 1,000 years, and then resumed exactly as it was? Would anyone notice? Could anyone notice? And this is the frozen time paradox, a thought experiment that questions whether time itself is observable, or whether it is merely an ordering of events, invisible and perhaps illusory. Imagine that at this very moment time stops, every atom ceases to move, every thought halts mid-formation, every photon hangs suspended in space, the entire universe frozen in a perfect still image. And this frozen state persists for an arbitrary duration, perhaps 1 billion years, and then suddenly time resumes, and everything continues exactly as it was. And the question arises, did anything happen during that frozen interval? Did time pass? And if no change occurred, can it be said that any time elapsed at all? The paradox strikes at the relationship between time and change, suggesting that time without change is meaningless or undetectable, that the passage of time is defined by the occurrence of events, and that if nothing changes, then nothing distinguishes one moment from another, and so the frozen interval, no matter how long, is equivalent to no interval at all. Aristotle grappled with this issue, arguing that time is the measure of change, that time does not exist independently of the processes it measures, and that without motion or change there can be no time. And this view suggests that the frozen time scenario is not a case of time continuing without change, but rather a case of time ceasing to exist during the frozen period. Others, particularly those who embrace the block universe view, argue that time is an independent dimension of space-time, that it exists whether or not anything changes within it, that the frozen interval would be a real extension of time, even if no events occurred within it. Though this raises the question of how such an interval could ever be detected or have any physical meaning. The paradox also touches on the nature of consciousness and subjective experience, because if time froze and then resumed, no conscious being would remember the frozen period, no measurement device would register it, no physical process would show evidence that it occurred, and so in what sense did it happen? And if it leaves no trace, can it be said to have any reality at all? Some philosophers draw a distinction between time as a parameter in physical equations, a variable that describes when things happen, and time as it is experienced, the feeling of duration and flow. And they suggest that the frozen time paradox exposes a gap between these two concepts, that mathematical time might continue during a frozen interval, but experiential time would not. The paradox connects to debates about the reality of time, whether time is fundamental or emergent, whether it is a feature of the universe or a feature of how we perceive the universe, and whether the flow of time, the sense that the present moment is moving forward, is an objective fact or a subjective illusion created by consciousness. Quantum mechanics adds another layer to the puzzle, because at the quantum level, the concept of time becomes strange. Entangled states do not evolve smoothly, but exist in superposition until measured. And some interpretations suggest that time emerges from quantum correlations rather than being a fundamental aspect of reality. The frozen time paradox forces confrontation with the question of what time is, whether it is possible for time to exist without change, whether duration has meaning in the absence of events, and whether the universe could be paused and unpaused without anyone ever knowing, without any physical consequence, and if such a scenario is indistinguishable from time continuing normally, then perhaps the question itself is meaningless, a pseudo-problem that arises from thinking about time as if it were a substance that flows rather than a dimension that orders. And yet the intuition remains that time is real, that it passes, that moments follow one another, and the paradox lingers as a reminder that even this most basic aspect of existence, the passage of time, is far from fully understood. The Galileo paradox. Galileo Galilei, in his final work Discorsi e dimostrazioni matematiche, presented a paradox about infinite quantities that anticipates later discoveries in set theory and challenges intuitions about size and comparison. And the paradox concerns the relationship between the natural numbers and the perfect squares, and Galileo observed that every natural number has a unique perfect square, obtained by multiplying the number by itself. And conversely, every perfect square corresponds to a unique natural number, its square root. And so there is a one-to-one correspondence between the natural numbers and the perfect squares, suggesting that there are just as many perfect squares as natural numbers, and yet the perfect squares are a proper subset of the natural numbers. Most numbers are not perfect squares. 1 is a square, 2 is not, 3 is not, 4 is a square, 5 is not, and so on, with squares becoming increasingly sparse as numbers grow larger. And this suggests that there are fewer perfect squares than natural numbers. And so Galileo's paradox is that the perfect squares seem to be both equal in number to the natural numbers by virtue of the one-to-one correspondence, and fewer in number by virtue of being a proper subset. And these two conclusions contradict each other, or seem to. And Galileo concluded that the concepts of equal, greater, and less do not apply to infinite quantities, that infinity transcends these comparisons, that we cannot meaningfully say that one infinite collection is larger or smaller than another. The paradox remained unresolved for centuries until the development of set theory by Georg Cantor in the late 19th century, and Cantor provided a systematic way to compare infinite sets, defining two sets to have the same cardinality if there exists a one-to-one correspondence between them, a bijection that pairs each element of one set with a unique element of the other. And under this definition, the natural numbers and the perfect squares have the same cardinality. Both are countably infinite. Both can be enumerated in a sequence, and the fact that the perfect squares are a proper subset of the natural numbers does not imply that they have a smaller cardinality, because infinite sets can be placed in one-to-one correspondence with proper subsets of themselves. And this property, far from being a contradiction or paradox, is the defining characteristic of infinite sets. The feature that distinguishes them from finite sets, where proper subsets always have strictly smaller cardinality. Cantor went further, showing that not all infinite sets have the same cardinality, that there is a hierarchy of infinities, that the set of real numbers is uncountably infinite, larger in a precise technical sense than the set of natural numbers. And this hierarchy extends infinitely upward, each level of infinity giving rise to larger infinities through power set constructions. And so, while Galileo's paradox shows that some infinite sets are equal in size despite one being a proper subset of the other, it does not follow that all infinite sets are equal, and the study of different sizes of infinity, of cardinal arithmetic, became a central part of set theory and mathematical logic. Galileo's paradox also raises philosophical questions about the nature of mathematical objects and the applicability of mathematics to the physical world, because if infinite sets have properties that violate finite intuitions, if the part can be equal to the whole when infinity is involved, then perhaps infinite quantities are not genuine quantities at all, but merely symbolic manipulations, mathematical fictions useful for certain purposes, but not corresponding to anything real. And this nominalist or instrumentalist view treats infinity as a convenient idealization rather than a description of actual totalities, and it sidesteps the paradox by denying that infinite collections exist, and so the paradox has no physical significance. It is merely an artifact of extending finite concepts beyond their proper domain. Others embrace the reality of infinite sets, arguing that mathematical objects exist independently of physical instantiation, that the natural numbers and the real numbers are abstract entities with determinate properties, and that Galileo's paradox reveals not a flaw in mathematics, but a truth about infinity, that infinite collections behave differently from finite collections, and that our intuitions, shaped by experience with finite quantities, must be revised when dealing with infinity. And this revision is not a retreat or a compromise, but an expansion of understanding, a recognition that reality, whether mathematical or physical, is richer and stranger than common sense suggests. The paradox also appears in physics and cosmology, in discussions of whether the universe is spatially infinite, whether it contains infinitely many galaxies, infinitely many stars, infinitely many particles, and if so, whether these infinities can be compared, whether one infinite quantity is larger than another, and whether operations like addition or subtraction are well defined for infinite quantities. And these questions do not have obvious answers. They depend on the mathematical framework used to describe the universe, on assumptions about the structure of space-time, and on whether infinite sets in mathematics correspond to infinite collections in reality. Galileo's paradox was one of the first systematic explorations of infinity, one of the first attempts to rigorously analyze what it means for a collection to be infinite, and it anticipated many of the insights that would later be formalized in set theory, and Galileo's conclusion that the usual comparisons of size do not apply to infinite quantities was both right and wrong. Wrong in that infinite sets can be compared, and some are larger than others, but right in that infinite sets do not obey the same rules as finite sets, that the part can be equal to the whole, that addition and subtraction of infinite quantities are not straightforward, and that intuition trained on finite examples is an unreliable guide. The numbers stretch to infinity, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and among them the perfect squares, 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, sparse but infinite. And the correspondence exists, each number paired with its square, each square paired with its root, and the two collections, one a subset of the other, are equal in cardinality, equal in size. And this equality, which seems to contradict the part being smaller than the whole, is not a contradiction, but a truth about infinity, a revelation that the infinite is qualitatively different from the finite, that the rules change when quantities are unbounded, and Galileo's paradox remains a landmark, the first clear formulation of the strange properties of infinite sets, the first hint that infinity would require new mathematics, new concepts, new ways of thinking about quantity and comparison. And the paradox endures, not as a problem to be solved, but as a lesson learned, a demonstration that infinity is not a large number, but a different kind of thing entirely, and that understanding it requires abandoning intuitions that serve us well in the finite realm, but mislead us when we venture into the infinite. The growing argument, Sejur. Objects change size over time. A child grows into an adult, a sapling becomes a tree, a pebble is worn smooth by erosion, and yet we say these are the same entities, the same person, the same tree, the same stone. But if size and shape change, can identity truly remain? And this is the growing argument, sometimes called the growing block paradox, or the problem of material constitution. A puzzle about how objects can gain or lose parts while remaining numerically identical to themselves. Consider a statue made of clay, and a sculptor adds more clay to it, making it larger, and then removes some clay, making it smaller, and at each moment the statue is made of different material, occupying a different volume, and yet we call it the same statue throughout the process. But if the statue is identical to the lump of clay that constitutes it, then the statue and the clay should share all their properties. Yet the statue has properties the clay does not. The statue has aesthetic value. The statue was created at a certain time. The statue could survive minor alterations, while the clay, as a mere lump, has none of these properties. And so the statue and the clay cannot be identical, even though they occupy the same space and are made of the same material. The paradox deepens when we consider the career of the clay. The lump existed before the statue was formed, and will exist after the statue is destroyed, and so the lump and the statue have different temporal boundaries. They begin and end at different times, and if they are not identical, then there must be two objects occupying the same space at the same time, the lump and the statue. And this seems strange, an unnecessary multiplication of entities. Some philosophers embrace this conclusion, arguing that the world contains far more objects than we ordinarily recognize, that every statue is accompanied by a lump, every organism by a mass of cells, every table by a quantity of wood, and that identity is highly context-sensitive, determined by how we carve up the world conceptually rather than by objective metaphysical facts. Others reject this view, arguing that the statue and the lump are the same object considered under different descriptions, that the properties that seem different are not intrinsic properties but extrinsic or relational ones, that being a statue is a matter of how the lump is shaped and how it is regarded rather than being a separate object. The growing argument also applies to living organisms. Because a person gains and loses atoms constantly, the body grows from infancy to adulthood, shrinks in old age, yet personal identity persists. And the question arises whether the person is identical to the collection of matter that makes up their body at any given moment. And if not, then what are they? And if so, then how can they survive the replacement of that matter over time? Mereology, the study of parts and wholes, offers various theories to address these puzzles. Some argue that objects are identical if they share all the same parts at the same time, while others allow for gradual replacement, saying that identity can be maintained as long as the changes are continuous and not too drastic. And still others embrace temporal parts, arguing that objects are four-dimensional, with different temporal slices, and that the question of identity over time is really a question of whether those slices are connected in the right way. The growing argument forces confrontation with the question of what objects are, whether they are material lumps, patterns, processes, or conventional designations, whether identity is absolute or relative, whether the world contains discrete, persistent entities or only a flux of matter temporarily arranged in stable configurations, and whether our language and concepts, which treat objects as enduring individuals, accurately reflect the structure of reality or impose a simplifying grid on something far more fluid and complex. The paradox remains unresolved, a source of ongoing debate in metaphysics, and it reminds us that growth and change, the most ordinary features of existence, conceal profound mysteries about identity, persistence, and the nature of the things that populate our world. The Grelling-Nelson paradox. Words can describe themselves or they cannot, and this seemingly innocent observation becomes a doorway into paradox when Kurt Grelling and Leonard Nelson posed a question in 1908 that has troubled philosophers of language ever since. Some words are autological, meaning they possess the property they describe. The word short is short. The word English is English. The word polysyllabic is polysyllabic. And these words refer to themselves in a way that feels consistent and unproblematic. Other words are heterological, meaning they do not possess the property they describe. The word long is not long. The word German is not German. The word monosyllabic is not monosyllabic. And again, this seems straightforward. A simple division between words that apply to themselves and words that do not. The paradox emerges when the question is asked, is the word heterological? Itself heterological. And the mind stumbles immediately into the same kind of self-referential trap that haunts the liar paradox and Russell's paradox. If heterological is heterological, then it does not describe itself, which means it must be autological. But if it is autological, then it does describe itself, which means it must be heterological. And the loop spins without resolution, each answer immediately negating itself. This is not merely a trick of language, but a genuine problem for anyone attempting to build a theory of meaning or reference, because it suggests that not all predicates can be safely applied to themselves, that self-reference introduces instability into linguistic systems. Some philosophers argue that heterological is simply a defective predicate, a word that fails to have a coherent meaning because its definition leads to contradiction. Much like dividing by zero produces an undefined result in mathematics. Others suggest that the paradox reveals the difference between the use of a word and its mention, that when we ask whether heterological is heterological, we are confusing the word as an object with the word as a concept, and this confusion generates the paradox. Alfred Tarski proposed that language operates on different levels, with a meta-language used to talk about an object language, and that paradoxes like Grelling-Nelson arise when these levels are improperly mixed, when language tries to fully describe itself from within rather than from a higher vantage point. The paradox also connects to broader issues in semantics and the philosophy of language, questions about how words acquire meaning, whether meaning is fixed or context-dependent, and what it means for a word to refer to itself. If even simple adjectives can generate contradictions through self-reference, then the project of creating a complete and consistent theory of language may be impossible, or at least far more complicated than it first appears. The Grelling-Nelson paradox lingers at the edges of linguistic theory, a small question with large implications. A reminder that words are not just labels for things, but slippery tools that can twist back on themselves in unexpected ways, and that the quest to understand meaning must navigate carefully around the traps that self-reference sets.